Hey, I'm Virginia LaRue, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing John Prestianni. And he is someone that became the newsletter editor turned alphabet in 1981, I believe. And so our history goes way back with the Friends of Calligraphy. So it's my pleasure that here we are many years later and being able to talk about what has commenced since then and how it all started. And so, John, I wanted folks to know your background and how you started in the field of calligraphy.
Well, thank you, Virginia. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you this morning. I'm very pleased to be asked to describe a portion of my life that was really about 40 years ago, but did span quite a bit of time after that initial period. So I am no longer really a practicing calligrapher. I have to say that my really active years in calligraphy spanned about 20 years. And then I changed careers and I became an attorney. I went to law school and I have been an attorney now far longer than I was ever a calligrapher, 30 years. And that was a very big change for me. And although it was really not unanticipated, because even before I became a calligrapher, I had wanted to become a lawyer. So the calligraphy portion of my life was kind of a very long distraction from what had been an early aspiration and goal. So to kind of tell you a little bit about myself, at the same time as I was a pretty academic kid, and I was pretty involved in school as a child, and I won't say I was an overachiever, but I was definitely, it was a very different time, and there were expectations, and I happened to, kind of do well in that environment. However, I also have an artistic side that is probably equally strong. Mm-hmm. And so I was always interested in art and in artistic things. And some of those interests were traditional things like drawing and painting, which I was very interested in even as a child. And as I became a teenager, I became interested in crafts, like ceramics. I was very interested in ceramics. I seriously considered becoming a professional potter. That interest extended well into my undergraduate years at UCLA, also at Immaculate Heart. I was interested in things like textiles. I did weaving, an amazing craft, jewelry making, things like that. And I discovered calligraphy in my first year of college at Immaculate Heart. And I saw the calligraphy of David Meckelberg, who was a faculty member. He had been a calligrapher working in the Midwest, and then transfer's not the right word, relocated to Los Angeles to work with Carita Kent, at the time Sister Carita, at Immaculate Heart, and he was deeply influenced by her and her teaching. But he had always been a calligrapher, and his involvement with calligraphy was at a time when there wasn't really grassroots interest in calligraphy. He corresponded with the big names of the time, Ray DeBoll, Lloyd Reynolds, Edward Kadich, also known as Father Kadich, James Hayes, and many others. He was very interested in italic handwriting, but also very proficient in formal calligraphy. So he taught calligraphy at Immaculate Heart, and I saw his work, and I was instantly drawn to it. I did take calligraphy, not with him. He left Immaculate Heart as a faculty member in my first year in college, and his partner, Richard Crawford, who was also an artist, took over the calligraphy instruction. So I took Richard Crawford's class, but then Richard recommended that I study privately with David, which I did, and for a number of months. And then I was offered a job as a student worker in the County of Los Angeles administration. They had a graphics department where Patricia Topping worked as a professional calligrapher with Etsuko Mura. And so I got a job, basically at the end of my first year of college, working in an office, a design office, as a student worker, doing endless certificates and signs and these, what would be considered small jobs. Occasionally I would do something that would be reproduced, but usually most of what they did, the large majority of what they did, were very elaborate, decorated. They called them scrolls. It was not engrossing. It was, broad pen calligraphy as we, think of it mainly today. Highly decorated, however. And I did that for 3 years. And that experience was very good because it was a kind of training that would be very difficult to get otherwise. But it also made me realize I didn't really want to work in that particular vein. It kind of confirmed my idea that I needed to finish my degree and then go to law school. And that did not happen because in my 4th year, I transferred to UCLA. In my 4th year there, I got a job offer to work in San Francisco for Friends of the Earth, doing graphic design and publication work. And I couldn't pass that up. I thought I would only be gone for a year and then I'd come back, but that didn't happen. I ended up staying in Berkeley. I lived in Berkeley, commuted to San Francisco for the job. And then I learned about a full-time calligraphy and bookbinding course in London, taught by Anne Camp at the Roehampton. It was called Digby Stewart College of the Sacred Heart at that time. It's now called the Roehampton Institute, as far as I know. And that is outside London in the southwest portion. It's outside of central London. And I hadn't traveled at all. I was only, 23, 24 at that time. And it wasn't like now. In the late 70s, it really wasn't. So somehow I put it all together and was able to do that as a student. I really didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know what that course would really be like, because I didn't really know about that teaching method. Anne Camp she's passed away, but she was very much in the Johnstonian tradition. She wasn't taught by Edward Johnston. She was taught by his students. Dorothy Money was one of them. I think she studied with, I believe his name was MC Oliver. And she was deeply mentored by Irene Wellington, who was not only Johnston's student, but one of his star students, and was his assistant. I believe it was either at the Central School or the Royal College of Art, one of the two. And so Anne's method was not to give out examples of calligraphy for people to copy that she would produce, which is the method that most teachers that I am aware of, at least with their beginners, use. They do exemplars and they pass them out to their students. She would do some very basic stuff like Roman capitals, very Johnstonian, all out of her book. She did a book which has been reprinted endlessly, Foundational Hand, but she stressed going to historical manuscripts. And so I went down that road. I became a reader at the British Library, just an incredible opportunity to actually handle manuscripts. And once I got into that, I didn't appreciate how deeply I would fall down that rabbit hole. But I did. And at the end of that time, she actually I wrote to her before I went, and she said, well, why don't you wait a year? Because I'm getting this certificate course going, and the certificate will not be available until a year after the time you want to come. And I wrote back and I said, no, I want to come now. And I didn't want to say I don't really care about a certificate, but I actually didn't. And but then after the year, I felt like, well, I wasn't going to get a certificate. So I decided to apply for fellowship in the Society of Scribes and Illuminators, which during the time I was a student, I was very, involved is not really the right word, but I became friends with, at the time, the secretary of the Society of Scribes and Illuminators, and would help her and would participate in a lot of the events that they had going on. So I kind of knew what they were doing, and it wasn't, and at that time it was not a grassroots type organization. It was mainly a professional organization. So I decided to apply for fellowship. I asked Donald Jackson to sponsor me. He did. And I was very lucky to be accepted as, I believe they called it craft membership at the time. Or they might have called it fellowship. I can't remember exactly, but that was a professional status. And you could write the initials SSI after your name, which in England people do, to indicate that professional status. Anyway, after that was over, I came back to the Bay Area, and what followed were a couple of years where I wasn't really sure what I started working again for Friends of the Earth, and then the Sierra Club. I kind of resumed the publication work, and I started teaching calligraphy for UC Extension and at California College of Arts and Crafts. Many of our friends and teachers in the FOC have also done that kind of teaching. So I started doing that, but I wasn't really doing much commercial calligraphy at that time. Wasn't sure. I really wanted to focus on my personal work. And I will say that even after all these years, what I am struck with is how personal the practice of calligraphy is. Now, calligraphy today is considered a part of lettering. This is my belief. Lettering is many things. Lettering is not necessarily calligraphic. Lettering can also be typographic, including type design. Okay, but calligraphy is more of it's really almost the basis of lettering in many ways, because certainly when printing was developed, typography was developed, which eventually put calligraphers out of business. It was during a time when it was based on manuscript hands, particularly humanistic manuscript hands, also Gothic manuscript hands. Okay, so when you think about like much later developments in lettering, like for example the sans serif typefaces that developed in the 19th century, which are kind of the basis for sans serif typography today, all of that has been done by hand as well. And so lettering is really what this is about. Calligraphy in our time, what Johnston and people like Edward Johnson and Rudolf Koch, kind of brought to the fore was using hand lettering, hand-done calligraphy as a method of expression, artistic expression. And so I think a lot of people are drawn to calligraphy for that reason. David Meckelberg used to say, handwriting is the one form of drawing done by most everyone. And there's a lot of truth to that. You may not know how to draw, you may not choose to draw, but if you know how to write, it is a form of drawing, and there have been many people who have explored that concept. It's certainly true for me. In 2019, I was feeling like I really wanted to kind of return to calligraphy because I spend my days doing legal work, endless amounts of that, and have for many years now. But I felt like I really want to get back to, kind of rekindling that interest. And I went to an FOC meeting for new members that was held at the San Francisco Public Library. And there were in attendance at that meeting were many of our veteran friends who have been doing calligraphy for 50 and 60 years, to, kind of be there in support of the many beginners in calligraphy. And what struck me, the beginners were invited to talk about themselves. And many of them showed us their practice sheets. Remember practice sheets? And I was watching this and thinking, this is interesting. They're not asking for critique, of their letter forms or for instruction. They're showing us their work. And it is their work. It's the work they're doing. And I thought, how personal this is. This is something that is inside of them, that this is where they are. This is what they're finding out. This is, as Sister Magdalene Mary at Immaculate Heart used to say, these are the graphs of our investigations. These are the graphs of our experiments. And indeed, that's what they were. So that brings me back to this period when I got back from my study in England. I was not ready to just dive into doing commercial work again. And it took me a couple of years to finally decide I needed to pay the rent. And so I would, I'd pound the pavement looking for work. So that's a little bit about me.
And I know our paths crossed when you were continuing your publication work, your interest in that. And a big step for the Friends of Calligraphy was the newsletter, and started by Don Moy, who set a very high standard of writing and depth and personal voice into the newsletter, the first Friends of newsletter. And it had a lot of meat, compared to just making announcements and announcement of classes and activities, but really meat about where calligraphy was at, some very outstanding teachers. And so I think Georgiana started that and followed. And then you had a suggestion. You say, given your standards and level of work and experience, you offered to become our newsletter editor, but you had another vision. And so what was that vision beyond the stapled sheets? What was your vision to take our newsletter to a magazine format?
Yeah, so it is very linked to my involvement with the Friends of Calligraphy. Okay, so when I was in England, and I don't remember how it came to me. It might have been through the secretary of the SSI. She would show me mail that she got from San Francisco. I'm thinking now that I'm thinking about it. I mean, I had been a member of the FOC before I went to England. For example, I took a Sheila Waters workshop that was sort of a mind blower for me. And I know, I think you were in that workshop as
Yes.
well. And so that would have been probably what, 1977, something like that.
Yeah.
But then when I went to England, you know, I wasn't in San Francisco, you know, I wasn't in the Bay Area. So, but I would see things. And so my interest, you know, I didn't really lose touch with it, even though I was away. And when I came back, one of the first things that happened was Susie Taylor invited me to show my work at the San Francisco Public Library in the book arts collection. That was in the old library, which is now the Asian Art Museum. And I was very flattered and, you know, kind of like me, have a show. But she, with her encouragement and support, I did, you know, I was happy to do that. So the work that I had at the time. And that was sort of the beginning of my friendship with Susie. I had met her. I had gone to the Harrison collection before I went to England, so I knew about it. She showed us things. My main memory of that early visit was seeing her calligraphy on all the little signs and, you know, tiny little tabs and thinking, oh my God, that calligraphy is just amazing, because she was a superlative calligrapher. And so Susie invited me to show my work, and that really was the beginning of my friendship with Susie, which I will say publicly was a very close relationship. She would send me letters almost every week from San Francisco to Berkeley. I lived across the bay, and we would talk on the phone. And so and I did some projects for the library. I did, you know, I had studied bookbinding, so I made some boxes and things. I needed money, and so she would commission me to do things. And so, you know, my becoming editor of the newsletter at the time, it didn't just happen. It wasn't just an idea that I suddenly came up with. Susie Taylor and I talked about it. She encouraged me. It was a big deal, not only because of what it was and the shoes that I would have to fill, but because I knew it would be a significant investment of volunteer time.
Yeah.
And so it was a bit of a challenge that required some consideration.
Yeah.
But I did feel that if I took it on, what was important was that I would be able to have a certain level of decision making about how it would be done. And one of the things that Don Moy had insisted on in the formation of the organization and its bylaws was that the position of the editor would have a lot of independence and would not be subject to really oversight, if you will, by the council. Okay. Now, his reasoning, as I understand it, was that he very wisely foresaw that an editor would need to be able to have that independence. Now, in the context of a volunteer organization, it's still rather remarkable that they to get agreement from the council to put that into the organization's bylaws. So, you know, my decision to take on that role really was considered in that context. Yeah. So, I mean, there was, you know, I did turn it into a printed booklet, if you will. It was no longer just stapled sheets. I mean, Georgiana had good reasons for doing it the way she did, and she did a fantastic job. as editor, but I really wanted something more more like a journal,
Yeah.
you know. And so there was enough budget to do that. I mean, it was always, you know, a problem of what could we afford? How much money did we have? But very soon after, I think it got around, it was one of the first publications like that. It was called I kept the name Newsletter for the first year. People recognize the value of something like that. And that is in large part because Don Moy and Georgiana Greenwood had set a very high bar in terms of the editorial content.
Yeah.
And so I felt I could build on that. And it got around, other societies saw it, realized that kind of an effort could really be justified if you could find people to do it. I think it may have had some impact on some of the actual commercial efforts like Calligraphy Idea Exchange, which later I believe became Letter Arts Review or was somehow connected to that. And so in the second year, I decided I didn't want to call it Newsletter anymore. I felt it was more, it needed a name. It needed a name. And so I named it Alphabet, and that name has remained. And people identify it with Friends of Calligraphy, whoever is the editor and however it's being done. I wanted it to be a substantive publication, meaning really topics on, you know, the practice. Yeah, however, whatever they were. I felt it was important to separate that out from the time value information about club activities, teaching workshops, because the teaching and workshops are the other half, really, or more, that Friends of Calligraphy is about, is to sponsor this teaching. Because remember, calligraphy used to be in the art schools.
Yeah.
Okay. In the first half of the 20th century, it was a subject that was essentially confined to art schools. And maybe there were professional craft organizations like Society of Scribes and Illuminators, but it was not a grassroots thing. You didn't have non-art students taking up calligraphy as a hobby. That, I mean, maybe you did, maybe there were some, and many of the really great calligraphers were self-taught, like Hermann Zapf did not go to art school. You know, he was a self-taught calligrapher. He studied Edward Johnston's writing and illuminating and lettering, and Rudolf Koch's book, and you know, others the same thing. Even Theo Jung here in the Bay Area was also autodidact. He was self-taught. But otherwise, it was something that was taught in art schools, and then that got phased out in the 60s and 70s. People like Donald Jackson and Anne Heckel were sort of the last of the art school grads who had actually been taught calligraphy in art school. What happened in the 70s, in the mid 70s in the Bay Area with things like Friends of Calligraphy, and then in Los Angeles Society for Calligraphy, were grassroots organizations. Now, they were mentored by professionals. Okay. Byron McDonald in the Bay Area was one of the great, you know, commercial calligraphers who did work at the highest levels. You know, Maury Nimoy in Southern California was, you know, also that kind of figure. There were others, of course. Egdon Margot in Southern California. There were others, but they were pros. You know, they had high-end accounts, you know, in corporate America, in the entertainment industry. I mean, you know, they had the kind of accounts where, you know, money was not really the object. It was the output. So these, I felt like a journal was appropriate because even though organizations like Friends of Calligraphy are grassroots, there still is a need to elevate to the level, I felt,
Yeah.
at least to the level of what the professional world, I'm not making a distinction really there. I'm just, if you go down this road of calligraphy and seriously, and you're talented, you will eventually reach a point where you want to be at a certain level of skill.
Yeah.
And so it's important to maintain that. And I think by and large, that has turned out to be true
I think so.
from what I can see.
Yeah. And having that level of alphabet, it really, I think, attracted many of our international teachers. Their desire to come to San Francisco and to share their knowledge. A lot of the lettering artists and calligraphers started coming from Europe to share their knowledge. Now, at the very beginning, of course, there was Donald Jackson. And when you said grassroots, that just fit in with really what Donald saw, that these groups are very interested in lettering, and they need to organize themselves in some way where it's a vehicle for these very fine artists to come and give workshops and to really expose our budding lettering artists to a very high level. And I would think, like Donald Jackson's influence on Thomas, on maybe Georgia Deaver and some of our Bay Area calligraphers.
Absolutely. Although it is important to remember that there is an American tradition. There always was.
Yes.
Okay. In New York, you had top flight professional calligraphers, Alice, for example, Paul Standard, George Salter. Now he was an immigrant, but he mainly lived in New York. And then there of course is the Midwest school. Okay. Ray DeBole, Oz Cooper, W.A. Dwiggins. He was a calligrapher. James Hayes. Those guys were, an earlier generation, but they are a direct result of the revival started by Edward Johnston. And then on the West Coast, you had, in addition to people like Maureen Amoy and Byron McDonald, who were teachers, you had Lloyd Reynolds at Reed in Oregon, and his influence was tremendous. And I'm, infinite. I never had an opportunity to meet him before he passed, but it's what a figure he was. So, but it is absolutely true from my perspective that teachers like Donald Jackson were instrumental in stimulating the grassroots revival of calligraphy in the 70s and on. From what I have read, I mean, he hasn't spoken to me. He's spoken to me somewhat about this, but over time I've kind of forgotten it. But he has written some things, and when he first came here, for example, he taught at Santa Cruz. He had some summer courses. Nobody had done that. They hadn't really done like this, famous calligrapher from Europe, in this case, England, who, was a product of that tradition dating to Edward Johnston directly, okay, coming here and teaching a class that's basically open to anyone. You don't have to be an art student. You don't have to be an admitted student in an art program. I mean, it was kind of an open thing, and they were shocked at what the interest was. People from all over the country came. Okay. Now, mind you, he was teaching things that perhaps Lloyd Reynolds wouldn't necessarily have been teaching, or Byron McDonald, like quill cutting and gilding.
Yeah.
Okay, now those things are, I mean, you can look at Edward Johnson's book and there's instructions on how to do that. So it wasn't like it was unknown, but people here who were doing calligraphy at the time, who were taking it up as an interest, did not know how to do gilding on gesso on their manuscripts. Reynolds, from what I know, did do things with, for example, reed, well, no pun intended, reed pens and bamboo pens and things like that, but not like, as far as I know, the traditional work, like using vellum and quills, goose quills, and then gilding with gesso. You just didn't really get that here. And Donald, he kind of brought that in. And then he also taught in Southern California and really stimulated a lot of interest there. I mean, people like Marcia and Larry Brady, who, very tragically passed away a few months ago in a car accident, were, they were right there. They kind of the spark, kind of like lit the spark for that. But yeah, and then of course, he began teaching workshops all over the country and the calligraphy conventions. Yeah, particularly in the Midwest, where he did that Bible project, the St. John's Bible. Yeah.
Well, I know you mentioned that you and Susie spent a lot of time together. Your love for calligraphy, and how was she such a glue? The day-to-day runnings of the special collections, because you spent a lot of time there. You knew what Susie did. Can you share a little bit about how she contributed to the Friends of Calligraphy in so many ways that held us all together as a...
She was, she was a powerhouse, basically, although if you knew her, you might not get that impression, but she really was. She lived and breathed everything calligraphic. I mean, she had her preferences. There are certain things she didn't like, she wouldn't pay any attention to, like she was not a fan, I hate to say it, of copperplate writing. Her interest was mainly broad pen writing, and she certainly understood about fine printing, because the Book Arts collection in San Francisco is several different collections. The Harrison collection is the one we're most interested in, and that, of course, is a lot of original work.
Yeah.
The printed work too, but in other words, reproductions of calligraphy. But the main focus of that is original calligraphy. However, there's also a component of books on calligraphy, which is a little bit neglected. And that's a topic that I'm very interested in right now, because, it takes a lot of time to read and to kind of digest books. And there's a lot of books that really aren't worth it, particularly instructional books. I remember when I had to move, I got sent, when I was editor, I got sent many, many review copies of books, and most of them I did not review or have reviewed. They weren't really worthy of it. And I think I ended up with several hundred books that I just didn't keep on calligraphy, which is sort of unheard of for me because I do collect books, but you have to draw the line somewhere. But they have a lot of really incredible books. If there's a book that would be hard to find, a very kind of rare book that you couldn't get, just check the San Francisco Public Library catalog. Almost invariably, if it's not on the shelf that can be borrowed, it's in the Harrison collection. But the Book Arts collection is more than just that. It's also the Grabhorn History of Printing, which is another large collection. And that's fine press stuff. So Susie as part of her job, had to, along with the librarians, manage all of that and maintain it. And so she had a lot to do, in her job, a lot of cataloging, conservation, just kind of keeping track of things, where things are kept. I mean, it's an enormous collection, even for something like what it is. It's not like a universe. It's not like the Bancroft, for example, which is much larger. But she also, because she's, as I said, she kind of lived and breathed this stuff, she was very involved in Friends of Calligraphy. She basically held every council position you could have. She was president at one time. She was treasurer even. She did handle membership for years. And she made the library, she made the book arts collection available to the community, the calligraphic community, and not just Friends of Calligraphy, but remember the Calligraphy Center?
Yeah.
That was Linda Ness and Thomas Ingmeyer who did that. And competing, the Friends of Calligraphy did not compete with the Calligraphy Center. They actually worked together.
Yes.
Okay. So she would foster all of that. Exhibitions, shows, classes coming in. I mean, when I was teaching, I brought my classes in to the library, and she always made time for us. She's gone now, and she retired about 5 years before she passed. But she, even in retirement, she would go to the library every week as a volunteer.
Yes.
Yeah, so she did keep up with it until the very end.
And you had a chance to do a few trips with her too, to Europe, actually.
We also studied at RIT for 2 summers with Hermann Zopf.
Yes.
We traveled out to Rochester along with a lot of other people, and took the master class in calligraphy the first year, and then in the second year we took it again, and we also took the typography class. And that was an amazing experience, of course. There were, Georgia Deaver was there. She took that. John Stevens was there. There were others from the Bay Area. I'm trying to remember. But just from all over, Jerry Kelly, Diane von Arx, many others. Sheila Waters' student, Julian Waters was there, of course. And we also went to, we made 3 trips to Europe. The first one I don't remember a whole lot of, but we visited the Hofers in southern Germany. We also went to Austria to visit Friedrich Neugebauer. We didn't take a class, but we just went there. We went to Salzburg and visited him. And then in 2000, and I think that must have been 1983 or so that we did that trip. And then fast forward, we went back to Germany in 2005. Linotype did a big celebration of Hermann Zopf's, might have been his late 80s. I'm thinking it was his 87th birthday. Don't quote me. There was an incredible experience with all the Germans and many Americans. They flew us all out there. And then the next year we went back and made a much more extended trip to Cologne, to Bremen, to Hamburg, and of course Frankfurt, of course Darmstadt, to see the Zopfs, who graciously took us to Michelstadt and Ammerbach, and it was incredible. Yeah, I'll never forget that one.
Well, being on the topic of Zopf, I know you worked on a celebration of Zopf. You want to mention that your
the Zopfest.
Your involvement in the Zopfest.
The Zopfest, which was a huge project, sponsored by Friends of Calligraphy.
Mhm.
And he was an honorary member. Herman Zoff was an honorary member, and Gudrun Zoff also.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And they had connections in San Francisco. They were close friends with Adrian Wilson.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had been out in the 80s. We met them in the 80s when they came. Zoff came a few times by himself,
Mhm.
but they came together in the 80s. I don't remember exactly the year. I'd have to look it up.
Mhm.
And to visit with the Wilsons. Zoff had projects. For example, he worked with Don Knuth at Stanford on the Metafont
Mhm.
and other things. He had a ton of energy, was just nonstop working all the time forever.
Mhm.
He never really retired.
Yeah.
And a lot of his working life was in consulting.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, of course, he was an incredible calligrapher, uh, also probably the greatest type designer of the 20th century. I don't doubt there's much argument about that. He's right up there with people like Gaudi and
Mhm.
others. So he did a lot of consulting. So he had some projects at Stanford, and he had projects in San Francisco.
Mhm.
Well, and some of them were just related to fine printing. Like, for
Mhm.
example, he I know one that he worked on with Adrian Wilson was a book called The Nuremberg Chronicles, which is a wonderful book about that. And the Zopfest, I was not involved in the beginning of that. So the genesis of it, Susie told me about it,
Mhm.
and she was I don't want to say it drove her crazy, but Susie was she would get anxious. Let's put it that way. She would get anxious, and she had very high standards,
Uh-huh.
and she would be very worried about mistakes or making sure that things were done right. She really
Mhm.
did want things to do right. So it was um, uh, it was a big effort. It was a
Mhm.
big effort. It was mainly, of course, she wasn't the only one. I mean, by any means, Linnea Lundquist
Mhm.
and Sumner Stone were, instrumental
Mhm.
in that project. I mean, because it was an exhibition that included a lot of younger designers who were involved in digital typography. And so it was sort of an interesting concept to combine that with honoring Zoff,
Mhm.
who who whose work spanned the entire spectrum
Mhm.
of the type technology,
Mhm.
from hand cut punch cutting for metal type to photo composition,
Mhm.
phototype, and then finally digital
Mhm.
type. Okay, all three different, and he designed for all of them,
Mhm.
and started in calligraphy
Mhm.
before he did any of that.
Uh-huh.
And so um, what it really was, so there were Jack Stauffacher, who passed away a few years ago, was also a great friend of Zopp,
Mhm.
and he was involved in the catalog,
Mhm.
along with a designer, and who he had mentored, and they didn't really have an editor.
Mhm.
For what they had was they had like a few kind of a small collection of articles, and they were trying to turn it into a catalog, and they were making efforts. And Susie felt like it really wasn't being developed in the way that she had an idea about how it should be developed, because she wanted it to include um, narrative about the Friends of Calligraphy and its history
Mhm.
and its connection
Uh-huh.
to the Zoff and to people like that
Mhm.
who would be made honorary members of the Friends of Calligraphy and would be sponsored to come and teach. Now, he never came here to teach a workshop, but we did have Neugebauer and Hofer
Yeah.
and many others,
Mhm.
come. And some of those I was involved in, those workshops, actually organizing them in the early years. I made some efforts in that, but she felt like the catalog needed a little bit more than so Stauffacher and his designer were not really responsible for the content
Mhm.
of this catalog, and yet Linnea had made the decision was made by Linnea and Sumner and Susie that this would be something that we would get funding for that could be printed as a book.
Mhm.
So she asked me if I would work on it as the editor, and I said yes,
Mhm.
I would, for her,
Uh-huh.
because it was causing her to lose sleep. And I felt like if she had enough confidence in me
Mhm.
to work with that project, because we had studied with Zopf together
Mhm.
at RIT,
Yeah.
and he was her hero.
Mhm.
He and Neugebauer
Mhm.
were her heroes.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Um, and he was a little bit my hero too, but I was a little more intimidated by him than she was. I mean, I just he was a little bit beyond me, but although it's an incredible person, just incredible, and much warmer and accessible, I think, than people gave him credit for. Certainly me. I mean, I was always shocked. I mean, once he called me from San Francisco airport, he just happened to be there at a layover, and I was on his list of people to call.
Uh,
So yeah, the catalog was not easy. It was not an easy project, but I did have some ideas that I think were relevant.
mhm.
For example, I asked Rick Cusick to contribute an account of Zopf's consultancy at
Mhm.
Hallmark
Mhm.
and the typefaces that he designed at Hallmark. And much to my surprise, he agreed to do that. He later
Uh-huh.
completely expanded on that topic and wrote his own book
Mhm.
about the Hallmark consultancy by Zopf, which he called "What Our Lettering Needs," which is just an incredible,
Mhm.
incredible book. Um, so there were things that you know um, I felt like I could do as the editor of the catalog. It was like everything I touch; it was very late. It certainly wasn't ready in time for the actual Zop Fest and the exhibition. It was not ready. And Herman said, "Why isn't it ready?" And I'd say, "Oh, it's just taking longer." I mean, it took a lot longer even than I thought to actually get it printed.
Mhm.
But it's a nice book. It turned out well. It's an interesting book. It's not just on the topic of Zoff. It includes other people, so um, it's got a little bit wider cover. And none of that was my idea. I was just helping to get it through.
Oh, well, that sounds like a pretty ambitious project that did get completed.
Well, the credit really goes to Sumner, Linnea, and Susie, and I can't remember who else was involved. And of course, there were lots of other people involved. I mean, many, many people involved. Um, it was at the San Francisco Public Library, the exhibition. So, of course, Andrea Grimes, who,
Huh?
is still there, um, was very involved in it, as well as others at the library. So the catalog acknowledges the help of all of those people, and there are many, many, many names in there of people who made that happen.
Oh,
So that's, kind of was a really wonderful experience, and kind of really demonstrated that Friends of Calligraphy really lives up to its name.
yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. Well, it really has gathered many lovers of letters and very has continued, you know, as a friends group and also a high level of art, you know, for us to keep striving for. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, John. It was just very interesting to hear the stories and to hear your involvement and the friends.
Oh, there's lots more.
An,
Yeah,
another Zoom meeting will
another Zoom meeting. Yeah,
pick another topic. Thank you so much for
you're
your
very welcome.
sharing and your time today.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.